You're just an old fossil playing pretend, Walter. Nobody actually needs you to run anything anymore. Vanessa said it smiling, swirling her wine like the sentence cost her nothing at all. Nobody at that table looked up. The ice in somebody's glass kept settling with a small dry click. A fork scraped once against a plate and stopped. My own son studied the tablecloth like it had suddenly become the most interesting fabric in Ohio. Nobody defended me, and nobody needed to defend me, because in that silence I understood exactly what I'd become in my own family's eyes. A spare key nobody remembered which lock it opened anymore, kept in a drawer out of habit, never used. Never quite thrown away either. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 64 years old. I spent 38 years running Briggs Electric out of a shop on Fenwick Avenue before I sold the business 3 years ago to my longtime foreman, a good man named Ray Delgado, and that dinner, my 64th birthday dinner, hosted at my own dining room table, was the night I found out exactly how little that history was worth to some of the people sitting around it. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is for people who spent their whole lives being underestimated and are done apologizing for it. Hit subscribe because the next hour is going to feel very good by the end. I want to tell you what happened at that table, because in about 11 minutes, a granddaughter I'd have died for would lean over and whisper 5 words that saved my life. And about 90 seconds after that, somebody in my own family was going to cut the power to my house on purpose. By the time the candles were relit that night, I'd already made a promise to myself that within a matter of weeks, everyone at that table who'd smiled while trying to hurt me was going to answer for it, in front of witnesses, with paperwork nobody could argue their way out of. But you need the wiring diagram of this family before the short circuit makes any sense. So let me back up. Eleanor and I were married 36 years before her heart gave out 2 years ago. Quiet and sudden, on a Tuesday morning, while she was watering the tomatoes. I still keep her reading glasses on the nightstand. I know that's the kind of detail a man's supposed to be embarrassed to admit on camera, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend I've got it together in every single way. Just because I know how to run a story like this one. I couldn't bring myself to move those glasses for 2 years. That's the truth, and I'm not ashamed of it. Even if I used to be. Our son Derek was 39 that year, a decent, tired-looking man who'd never quite found the thing that lit him up the way electrical work had lit me up at his age. He married Vanessa 9 years back, a sharp, striking woman who ran a little bistro downtown called Vanessa's Table, and for a long time I told myself the coolness I sometimes felt off her was just 2 strong personalities circling each other. Our granddaughter Lily was 8, quiet and watchful in the particular way only children raised around adults, pretending everything's fine tend to be, and she was, without question, the best part of my week, every week. Here's the number that matters, so you understand exactly what was on the table that night in every sense of that phrase. After Eleanor passed and I sold the shop to Ray, the trust I'd set up held a little over $2,100,000. The shop sale. Our house paid off free and clear 30-some years of a man who never took a vacation he couldn't afford in cash. And Vanessa's bistro, I'd find out later, was carrying just under $340,000 in debt. It could not survive another bad quarter. I want to be honest about something before I go further, because a man telling you a story like this owes you his blind spots, not just his triumphs. I wasn't the easiest father Derek ever had. I built that business with my hands and my back and about 4 hours of sleep a night for most of his childhood, and there were school plays I missed, birthdays where I walked in during the last 10 minutes still smelling like conduit sealant. My own mother spent her last 6 years in a nursing home 2 states away, and when she begged me not to put her there, I told myself I knew better than she did what was good for her. And I signed the papers anyway, because it was easier than sitting with her fear. I'm telling you that now because it matters later, and because I think a man who's about to spend the next few weeks fighting for his own dignity ought to admit, at least once, that he understands exactly how somebody ends up believing they're allowed to make that decision for somebody else. The birthday dinner had been Vanessa's idea, which should have been my first clue, since Vanessa didn't usually volunteer to cook for anyone she couldn't bill for it. She'd been unusually attentive for about 6 weeks leading up to that night, calling more than she used to, asking oddly specific questions I brushed off at the time. Whether I was still taking my blood pressure medication on schedule, whether I ever mixed up my morning pills, whether I'd noticed myself getting more forgetful lately. I told her I was fine. I believed I was fine. There'd also been a charge on my credit card statement that spring I didn't recognize, $40 to something called Feld Wealth Advisors. And when I mentioned it to Derek, he said it was probably a subscription I'd forgotten about. And I let it go, because that's what you do when you trust the people sitting across from you. Lily had drawn a picture that same spring that I found taped to her bedroom door when I babysat one Saturday. A man in a gray suit standing at their front door, and underneath it, in her careful 8-year-old print, the words, "The man who visits when daddy's at work." When I asked her about it, she just shrugged and said he brought mommy flowers sometimes and told her not to tell daddy because it was a surprise. I didn't think much of it. I'm not proud of that either. I didn't know it yet, but I'd already been handed 2 of the 3 threads that would eventually unravel this whole thing, and I'd folded them both up and put them away like they didn't matter. The night of the dinner, Vanessa made a production of the whole thing. Candles, a cake she'd clearly bought from the good bakery on 3rd, and dressed up to look homemade. Derek pouring wine like a man performing hospitality rather than feeling it. Ray came, because Ray always comes, sitting across from me in his work flannel, looking like he'd rather be anywhere that didn't require a necktie. My neighbor Doris came too, and a couple of Vanessa's restaurant friends I didn't know well, which struck me even then as strange for what was supposed to be a family dinner. That comment about the fossil came about 40 minutes in, right after I'd made some offhand remark about maybe helping Ray train a new apprentice at the shop. Just consulting, nothing that would put me back on a ladder. Vanessa's smile when she said it was warm enough that a stranger might have missed the blade underneath. Derek didn't defend me. That's the detail I keep circling back to, even now. My own son looked at the tablecloth and let it sit there. Dinner moved on the way dinners do when everyone's decided not to notice something. The cake came out. Everyone sang badly the way families do. Lily sat next to me, which she always did, close enough that her knee bumped mine under the table, and about 10 minutes after the singing, right as Vanessa was cutting the first slice and placing it in front of me with a fork, already balanced on the plate, Lily leaned in close to my ear. "Grandpa," she whispered, so quiet I almost lost it under the sound of everyone still clapping. "Don't eat that. I saw Mommy put something in it from her purse." I want you to sit with how strange those next 90 seconds felt, because I've relived them more times than I can count. I didn't move the fork. I didn't say a word. I just sat there with my granddaughter's hand, gripping my sleeve under the tablecloth, doing the math on her face. She wasn't playing. She wasn't confused. She had the flat, urgent look of a kid who knows exactly what she saw and is terrified nobody will believe her. And that's when the lights went out. Not a flicker. Not the stutter of a bulb dying. A full, immediate, total blackout. The overhead fixture, the string lights on the porch visible through the window, even the little green standby light on the microwave across the kitchen. In 38 years of wiring houses for a living, I've learned the sound and feel of every kind of electrical failure there is, and I can tell you, sitting in that dark dining room with my granddaughter's fingers still locked around my wrist, some part of me that had nothing to do with grief or paranoia knew immediately that wasn't a breaker tripping from overload. A tripped breaker doesn't cut every circuit in a house simultaneously and cleanly like somebody threw a single master switch. Something had been flipped, not blown. There was maybe 15 seconds of chaos in the dark. Chairs scraping, Doris gasping, somebody's phone flashlight swinging wildly across the ceiling, and in that 15 seconds, I heard the specific, unmistakable sound of a plate sliding an inch or two across a tablecloth, right in front of me. When Derek got the lights back on, using his own phone as a flashlight, the slice of cake in front of me had been swapped for a fresh one, cut from the untouched half still sitting on the counter. Nobody said a word about it. Vanessa was already laughing, saying something about the old wiring in this house. Wasn't it just like Walter's place to short out on his own birthday? And everybody laughed with her, and I laughed too, because 38 years in the electrical trade also teaches you that the smartest thing you can do the instant you spot a live wire somebody else doesn't know you've found is to not touch it in front of them. I ate exactly 2 bites of that second slice before I set my fork down and said I was feeling a little dizzy from the excitement, which got me sympathetic murmurs and an early good night instead of questions. Later that night, alone in my own kitchen with Lily long since taken home and everyone else gone, I felt my heart doing something strange and fast in my chest, my hands shaking in a way 2 bites of cake had no business causing, and by 11 o'clock I was in the emergency room getting my stomach checked, and a very careful, very kind doctor telling me my blood work showed elevated levels of a sedative I had absolutely no prescription for. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to spend the next several weeks becoming a much better actor than my own daughter-in-law. I called Ray from the hospital waiting room a little after 2 a.m., because Ray's the kind of friend you call at 2 a.m., without apologizing for it. He was at my house in 11 minutes flat, still in the same flannel from the party, and he sat with me in those miserable plastic chairs while I laid out everything. The 8-year-old's whisper, the plate that had somehow become a different plate in 15 seconds of darkness, the talk screen showing a sedative I never took, the breaker that hadn't behaved like any tripped breaker I'd seen in nearly 4 decades of wiring houses. "You're telling me you think Vanessa tried to drug you at your own birthday party," Ray said slowly, like he was hoping I'd correct him. "I'm telling you my granddaughter saw her do it. And the wiring in my house did something I've never once seen a genuine fault do in 38 years, I said. You do the math. Ray didn't laugh it off. And I've loved that man like a brother since he was 23 years old with more ambition than sense, precisely because he didn't laugh it off. He just sat there a long moment, jaw working, and then he said the thing that ended up steering the whole next stretch of this story. Then we don't confront her tomorrow, he said. Because the second she knows you're onto her, she stops leaving a trail. You're an electrician, Walter. You know better than anybody. You don't go poking a live circuit with your bare hand. You cut the power first, quiet, on your own terms, and then you go in and see what's actually wrong. I sat there in that fluorescent-lit waiting room, my granddaughter's whispered warning still ringing in my ears, and I made the decision that would define the next month of my life. I wasn't going to confront anyone yet. I was going to find out exactly how deep this ran, exactly who else was standing behind Vanessa in the dark, and exactly what they thought they were going to take from me, before I let a single one of them know I'd survived my own birthday. The next morning, still hollowed out and shaky from the night before, I drove to my own breaker panel in the garage before I'd even made coffee. And what I found there confirmed the last thing I wanted to believe about my own family. The breaker panel in my garage was original to the house, but I'd rewired half of it myself 12 years back when we upgraded the kitchen, so I knew every inch of that box better than I knew my own reflection. Every switch was thrown to off. Every single one, not just the circuits feeding the dining room. A genuine fault trips the breaker closest to the overload and leaves the rest of the panel alone. What I was looking at was a full, manual shutdown, and there, on the dusty concrete floor directly beneath the panel, was a single fresh scuff mark from a shoe that wasn't mine, and a faint smear of the same $40 hand cream Vanessa always left half empty in my bathroom whenever she stayed over. I stood there a long time with my coffee going cold in my hand, doing something I hadn't let myself do since the emergency room the night before, which was actually feel it. Not the fear I could work with. It was the other thing, the specific, useless grief of realizing that somebody who calls you dad had stood in your garage in the dark on purpose, with her hand cream still on her fingers, and decided you were worth less alive and clear-headed than you were sedated and confused. I'm not going to pretend that didn't put me on the kitchen floor for a few minutes, back against the cabinets, the way grief does to a man, no matter how many decades he's spent convincing people he doesn't have a soft side. Then I got up, because that's the other thing 38 years in a trade like mine teaches you. You don't get to sit next to a live wire forever feeling sorry for yourself. Eventually, you either fix it or somebody gets hurt. I called the same client who'd once hired me to rewire her dental office, a sharp woman named Louise who mentioned years back over coffee that her brother did private investigation work out near the county line. His name was Nathan Callahan, mid-50s, 22 years on the Columbus police force before he'd hung out his own shingle, and his office sat above a tax prep place that only seemed to be open in April. It looked exactly like you'd expect. A metal desk, a filing cabinet missing one handle, a framed commendation hanging slightly crooked, and a man behind the desk who listened to my entire story without writing down a single word. "I remember better than I write," Callahan said, when I asked him about it. "Writing's for the report I hand you once I know what's worth putting on paper." I told him everything: the sedative in my blood work, Lily's whisper, the breaker panel, the mysterious $40 charge to something called Feld Wealth Advisors, the fact that Vanessa's bistro was clearly hemorrhaging money, if the wear on her staff's uniforms and the empty dining room I'd noticed on my last visit were any indication. Grieving, frightened men imagine all kinds of things, Callahan said when I finished. But grieving men don't usually hand me a specific brand of hand cream and a scuff mark measurement. Either you're imagining the most detailed hallucination I've ever heard, or somebody in your family made a mistake they don't know you caught yet. "Which is it?" I asked. "Give me a week," he said. "I'll tell you if there's a fault in this wiring, or if you're just an old man jumping at shadows." That week was the longest 7 days of my life, and I spent every single one of them doing the same thing I imagine most people in my position end up doing: pretending nothing was wrong badly to people I used to be able to fool without even trying. Derek called twice that week, both times sounding strange and clipped, asking how I was feeling, whether the doctors had said anything, whether I remembered exactly what I'd eaten that night. I told him I felt fine, a little tired, probably just my age catching up with me, and I listened to my own son exhale in what sounded uncomfortably close to relief. That's the detail that hurt worse than almost anything else in this whole story. Not that Vanessa had done what she'd done, but that some part of Derek seemed to be hoping I'd conclude nothing unusual had happened at all. I saw Lily twice that week, too, once when Derek dropped her at my house for a Saturday afternoon while he ran errands, and it was during that visit that I got the second piece of evidence I hadn't been looking for. She was drawing again, cross-legged on my living room floor, and when I glanced over her shoulder I saw a small spiral notebook sitting beside her sketch pad, the kind you'd buy for $1 at a drugstore. "What's that one for?" I asked, careful to keep my voice light. "It's my remembering book," she said, not looking up from her drawing. "Mommy said your memory's getting bad, so I started writing down things that happened so I can help you remember them if you forget." I asked, as gently as I could manage, whether I could see it, and she handed it over without hesitation, the way children do when they haven't yet learned that some information is dangerous to share. Inside, in her careful print, were dated entries going back nearly 2 months. The man in the gray suit visiting 3 separate afternoons while Derek was at work. A fight she'd overheard through her bedroom wall, where her mother said something about, "Once the money clears, we're finally free of this." An afternoon where Vanessa had asked her to go play in the yard, right when the man in the gray suit arrived, and Lily had watched from the window instead. I sat on my own living room floor with an 8-year-old's handwriting in my hands and felt something shift permanently in my chest. Not just anger at Vanessa anymore. Something colder and more determined, aimed at whoever that man in the gray suit turned out to be. "Can I keep this safe for you?" I asked her, "just so nothing happens to it." She shrugged and said sure and went back to her drawing, and I sat there a long moment longer than I should have, watching my granddaughter color in a picture of a dog, thinking about how she'd stumbled into carrying evidence heavier than anything an 8-year-old should ever have to hold, simply because the adults around her had decided her grandfather's mind was something they were allowed to auction off. There's something I need to admit here, because I promised you honesty and not just triumph. I still couldn't bring myself, that whole week, to sit in Eleanor's chair at my own kitchen table. I'd been avoiding it since she died. 2 years of eating standing up at the counter, or in the den in front of the television rather than face that empty seat. And that week, with everything closing in, I caught myself doing it more than ever, flinching away from that particular corner of my own kitchen like it might reach out and touch me. Ray noticed. Ray always notices. "You've been avoiding that chair for 2 years, Walter," he said one evening, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, while I stood at the counter eating a sandwich like a man 20 years younger, with no dignity left to protect. "I'm not going to pretend I understand grief the way you do, but I know avoidance when I see it because I've been doing my own version of it since my wife left." "Some things you just don't touch," I said. "Yeah," he said, "until you have to." Callahan called me on the 7th day, and I remember exactly where I was standing because I was in my garage again, staring at that breaker panel like it might apologize to me when my phone buzzed. "You sitting down?" he asked. "I'm standing next to my own fuse box, close enough. Your daughter-in-law's restaurant is $341,000 in debt, mostly to 2 different lenders threatening to call the loans this quarter. And that $40 monthly charge you didn't recognize? Feld Wealth Advisors is a boutique estate planning outfit run by a man named Marcus Feld, and according to a former employee of his I managed to get talking, he's been quietly positioning himself as the trust administrator on at least 2 other elderly clients' accounts over the past 3 years, both of whom ended up in guardianship arrangements that gave Feld significant control over asset management fees. There's a pattern here, Walter, and your daughter-in-law is not the first person he's run this play with." My mouth went dry. "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning somebody's been quietly gathering the paperwork to have you declared incompetent to manage your own finances," Callahan said. "There's a preliminary competency evaluation on file with a Dr. Renner, dated 3 weeks ago, that you never sat for. And meaning your daughter-in-law and Marcus Feld have been a lot more than professional acquaintances for at least the last several months. The former employee I talked to described them as, and I'm quoting her here, inseparable at 2 different industry events. I had to put my hand flat against my own workbench to stay upright." "There's more," Callahan said, "because there's always more. Feld's firm filed a petition for a guardianship hearing 11 days ago. It's scheduled 3 weeks out. If it goes through uncontested, based on Renner's evaluation, a court-appointed conservator, which, surprise, Feld's firm has already recommended themselves for, gets authority over your entire trust. Your daughter-in-law's name is listed as the petitioning family member. 3 weeks. I stood in my own garage, next to the panel where somebody I used to trust had cut my power in the dark, and did the math on exactly how much time I had left to prove I still knew how to read my own wiring. I called my attorney the next morning, a sharp, unflappable woman named Diane Castellano who'd handled my business contracts for 15 years and had absolutely no patience for anyone who tried to talk over her, which was exactly what I needed. "Here's your situation," she told me, flipping through the printout Callahan had put together, the talk screen results, photographs of the breaker panel, Lily's notebook laid carefully in a folder between us. "If this guardianship petition proceeds and a judge accepts Dr. Renner's evaluation, you could lose direct control over your own trust to a conservator recommended by the very firm that appears to have engineered the circumstances used to justify the petition. That's not just family dysfunction, Mr. Briggs. Depending on what we can prove about intent, that's elder financial abuse and potentially attempted poisoning and conspiracy to defraud. So what do I do?" "You do exactly what they're doing," she said. "You build an airtight record, quietly, while they still believe you're exactly as confused and unaware as they need you to be. And when this comes apart, Mr. Briggs, and it will come apart, people running a scheme like this always overreach eventually. You're going to be the one standing on solid ground with documentation, and they're going to be standing on nothing. Standing on nothing." I turned that phrase over more times than I can count in the days that followed, mostly at 2 and 3 in the morning, lying awake in the house I'd shared with Eleanor for 36 years, listening to the particular silence of a place where somebody you loved isn't anymore. Ray, predictably, wanted to burn the whole thing down immediately. "Confront her tonight," he said. The two of us sitting on the tailgate of his truck outside my garage one evening, sharing a six-pack neither of us was really tasting. Show her what you found. Watch her face. If I confront her now, she adjusts the plan, I said. She delays, she covers her tracks. Maybe she never even shows up to that hearing and just finds some other angle to get at the trust. If I let this play out, I control when it ends, not her. Ray studied me a long moment. The way he used to study a panel he suspected was wired wrong but couldn't quite prove yet. You've changed since Eleanor, he finally said. Not in a bad way, just you used to fix things the same day somebody called you with a problem. Now you're sitting on your hands watching your own life short out in slow motion. I'm not sitting on my hands, I said. I'm letting the fault show itself before I go rewiring anything. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to spend the next 3 weeks becoming a far more convincing performer than either Vanessa or the man in the gray suit who'd been visiting my son's house while Derek was at work. I called Derek that same week and asked, casual as I could manage, whether he and Vanessa and Lily wanted to come by for Sunday dinner the way we used to before things got so complicated. He said yes, sounding relieved in a way that told me he was still hoping, somewhere underneath whatever he already half knew, that his father really was just a confused old man who'd had a strange reaction to a slice of cake, and not a witness quietly assembling a case against his own wife. I set the table that Sunday with Eleanor's good dishes for the first time in 2 years, and for the first time in 2 years, I made myself sit in her chair while I did it just to see if I still could. I found out I could. Barely. But I could. Sunday dinner with Derek, Vanessa, and Lily became, over the following 3 weeks, the strangest performance of my life, and I want to tell you honestly that some nights I was better at it than others. Vanessa arrived that first Sunday with a bottle of wine and an apology for the birthday dinner disaster, blaming the old wiring in the house, laughing about how she'd been meaning to tell me for months I should get an electrician out to look at that panel, which, delivered to a man who'd spent 38 years as exactly that, and who now had photographs proving her own shoe print stood beneath it in the dark, took every ounce of self-control I had not to answer with something I couldn't take back. Instead, I laughed along with her. I said maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to have somebody look at it. I watched her relax by 2 full degrees across the table, the particular ease of a woman who believes the last loose thread in her plan has just been swept safely under the rug. And I understood in that moment exactly what Diane Castellano had meant about letting people stand on nothing before you pull it out from under them. Derek was harder to read that whole stretch. And it's Derek I want to talk about now, because he's the part of this story that still, even after everything, makes my chest tighten a little when I think about it. He'd started calling me more, not less, over those 3 weeks. Short calls, awkward ones, where he'd ask how I was sleeping, or whether I'd been dizzy again. And underneath the surface of those questions I began to hear something else entirely. Not suspicion of me. Something closer to a man circling his own doubts about his wife and refusing, out of some mixture of loyalty and fear, to look directly at them. Vanessa's been different lately, he said to me once. The two of us alone in my garage while Vanessa and Lily picked up takeout, Derek turning a socket wrench over in his hands without actually using it for anything. The universal gesture of a man who needs somewhere to put his hands while his mouth says something harder. Distracted. On her phone a lot. Won't say who she's texting. Different how long? I asked, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. Few months, maybe. Since the restaurant started struggling, he set the wrench down. You don't think? And then he stopped himself, shook his head, laughed it off in that particular way people do when they've gotten close enough to a truth to feel its heat and decided they'd rather not get burned. I didn't push him that night. Diane had been clear about that part of the strategy. Derek needed to arrive at the truth close enough to the hearing that he couldn't warn Vanessa in time to adjust, but far enough ahead that when it landed, he'd already done some of the work of doubting her himself, which would make the final blow land as confirmation rather than a total ambush. It felt cold, plotting the emotional arc of my own son's heartbreak like a wiring schematic. I'm not going to pretend it didn't, But I also wasn't the one who'd built the circuit that was about to short out his marriage. I was just the man finally willing to trace where the current actually went. Callahan called me midway through that second week with the piece of the puzzle that turned this from a financial scheme into something considerably darker. "Your instincts about Feld and your daughter-in-law were right," he said. "I had somebody do some careful, entirely legal digging, hotel loyalty records, a cooperating desk clerk was willing to walk me through, nothing hacked, nothing pulled without permission. They've been meeting regularly for the better part of 5 months at a place off the interstate neither of them has any obvious reason to visit. And Walter, there's something else. Feld's done this exact play twice before, with 2 other elderly clients in 2 different counties. Same pattern: get close to a financially desperate family member, position himself as their trusted advisor, engineer a competency crisis, get appointed conservator, and once the assets are under his control, extract management fees for years before anybody thinks to question the arrangement. One of his previous conservatorship clients died 18 months into the arrangement, with less than a third of her original estate remaining. I sat with that for a long moment, the phone pressed to my ear, feeling something in my chest that had nothing to do with fear anymore. "You're telling me Vanessa isn't the architect of this. She's a tool somebody else is using." "I'm telling you Feld's run this exact scheme on 2 other families and walked away clean both times," Callahan said. "And I'd bet a fair amount of money your daughter-in-law thinks she's his partner in this, maybe even thinks there's a future for the 2 of them once the money clears and she's free of your son. I don't think she has any idea she's the 3rd woman he's done this with, or what happened to the last 2 families once he got what he needed from them." That detail changed something in how I carried the next 2 weeks. I still had no forgiveness in me for Vanessa. A woman doesn't get to slip sedatives into her father-in-law's birthday cake and call it a misunderstanding. But I found myself thinking about her differently, the same way you think about a wire that's been improperly grounded, rather than one that was simply built wrong from the factory. Somebody had gotten to her first. That didn't make what she'd done to me acceptable. It just meant there was more than one villain in this particular story, and one of them didn't even know yet that he was about to be exposed as having used her the exact same way he'd used 2 women before her. I need to tell you about a night that happened right in the middle of that stretch, because it's the moment I came closest to breaking the whole plan open early, and I think you deserve to understand exactly how much it cost me to hold the line. Lily stayed over at my house that Wednesday. A school half-day, Derek working late, Vanessa at the restaurant, which by then I understood might or might not have been true. We made grilled cheese for dinner, and afterward, while I washed the pan, she sat at the counter, swinging her feet against the stool, and asked me a question that stopped me cold with my hands still in the dishwater. "Grandpa, why do grown-ups say they love you, and then do things that don't feel like love at all?" I turned around and looked at her, this 8-year-old who'd been quietly documenting her own mother's affair and a stranger's visits without fully understanding what any of it meant, only understanding that something in her house didn't add up, and I didn't have an answer ready that felt honest enough for her. "I don't know, sweetheart," I finally said. "I think sometimes people convince themselves that getting something they want matters more than keeping a promise they made, and I think it usually costs them a lot more than they expect it to. Is that what Mommy's doing?" I set the pan down very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid of breaking. "What makes you ask that?" "Because you've been different since your birthday," she said, matter of fact in the specific, devastating way children are when they've noticed everything and processed none of it yet. "And Mommy's been different too, and I don't like it." I crossed the kitchen and pulled her into a hug right there at the counter, and I want to tell you that I am not, generally, a demonstrative man. Eleanor used to tease me that I showed affection through fixed appliances rather than words, and she wasn't entirely wrong, but I held on to that little girl longer than either of us probably needed, and somewhere in the middle of it I felt her small hand fist into the back of my shirt and hold on just as tight. "I love you," I told her, into the top of her head, And I promise you, whatever happens in the next few weeks, none of it is because you did anything wrong by telling me the truth. You did exactly the right thing, and I need you to remember that no matter what." She didn't ask me anything else that night, but she held on to that notebook of hers a little tighter. After that, I noticed, like she understood, in whatever way an 8-year-old understands things, that it mattered more than she'd first realized. Diane filed the paperwork that same week, a formal objection to the guardianship petition, attaching the talk screen results, the photographs of the breaker panel, an affidavit from Callahan detailing Feld's prior conservatorship history with 2 other families, and, with my reluctant blessing, a redacted summary of Lily's notebook. Her identity as a minor protected, but her observations entered into the record through a child welfare advocate. Diane insisted on bringing in to make sure nothing about how we used that evidence could ever be turned around and used against the little girl who'd handed it to us. "This isn't a slow-moving case anymore," Diane told me, the 2 of us sitting in her office with the hearing date circled in red on her desk calendar. A judge seeing a documented sedative in an elderly petitioner's blood work, a manually disabled breaker panel, and a pattern of prior conservatorship abuse by the recommending firm is going to take this seriously fast. I've also looped in the county's elder abuse investigator, who confirmed she's aware of at least 1 open complaint against Feld's firm already. This is bigger than your family, Walter. You may be the person who finally stops him." I sat with that a long moment. Somewhere in the last 3 weeks, this had stopped being only about protecting my own trust and started being about a pattern of harm that had already cost at least 1 other elderly person nearly everything she had. "There's one more thing," Diane said more carefully now. "Given the strength of what we have, I don't think we need to wait passively for the hearing date. I think there's value in you confronting this directly, on your own terms, in front of your family, before it ever gets to a courtroom. A judge responds to documentation. But a family, Walter, a family sometimes only responds to being made to look at itself." That's when I told her the idea I'd been turning over for days, the one Ray had half-talked me out of and half-talked me into every single time we discussed it. I wanted to host a second birthday celebration, a do-over. I'd tell Derek, since the first one had been ruined by the power outage and my hospital trip, timed exactly 1 week before the guardianship hearing, at my own house, with everyone invited, including, at my specific and deliberate request, Marcus Feld, whom I would introduce to Vanessa's restaurant, friends, and my own neighbors as her new business consultant, a man I was eager to finally meet. "You want to detonate this in front of an audience," Diane said slowly. "I want everyone standing in the room to see exactly who they've been sitting across the table from," I said. "I spent 38 years teaching apprentices that you don't just replace a bad wire quietly in the middle of the night and let the homeowner think the house was always safe. You show them the damage. You let them understand what almost happened, so they never let it happen again." Diane studied me a long moment, and for the first time since I'd walked into her office 3 weeks earlier looking, I imagine, like a hollowed-out old man clutching a folder of his own family's betrayal, she almost smiled. "I figured you'd land somewhere like this eventually," she said. "I'll have everything ready. And Walter, I want to be there when it happens." "So do I said. Ray, of course, had opinions about the timeline, because Ray always has opinions. "You're really going to sit across a table from the man sleeping with your daughter-in-law and hand him a slice of cake," he said. The 2 of us on his tailgate again, sharing what had by then become something like a nightly ritual. "I'm going to sit across a table from him and let him believe he's already won," I said. "Right up until the moment he understands he hasn't won anything at all." "And Derek?" That was the question that kept me up more nights than any other part of this plan. "Derek's going to find out his wife's been having an affair with the man trying to have his father declared incompetent, in front of half the neighborhood, at a dinner party," I said. "I've turned that over every way I know how, Ray, and I can't find a version of this where that doesn't hurt him badly. All I can do is make sure it hurts him with the truth instead of with more lies, and that I'm standing right next to him when it happens." Ray was quiet a long moment, looking out at the dark street. For a man who spent 40 years running conduit and grounding panels, you turned into a pretty sharp trial strategist these last few weeks. I had a good lawyer and an even better granddaughter, I said. I just did the wiring. There was a moment near the end of that third week where I nearly lost my nerve entirely. Vanessa called me on a Thursday evening, her voice doing that particular soft, careful thing it had started doing around me since the birthday dinner. The voice of someone checking on a man she believed to be fragile, or perhaps, I understood now, checking on a man whose fragility she was actively manufacturing. "I've just been thinking about you a lot," she said. "I know things have been strange since your birthday. I want you to know, Derek, and I only ever want what's best for you, Walter. We just worry, that's all. We love you." I sat there in my kitchen in Eleanor's chair, which I'd finally started sitting in again most evenings, and felt the old version of myself, the version that had married into a family and genuinely believed, for years, that he'd found people who loved each other the way Eleanor and I had once loved each other. Nearly answer her honestly. "I know you're scared," I almost said. "I know Feld has convinced you this is your only way out. It's not too late to walk away from this before it costs you everything." Instead, I said, "I know you do, Vanessa. I appreciate you checking on me," and let her hear exactly the gratitude she wanted to hear, while some colder, steadier part of me filed away the exact tone of her performance, matching it against everything Callahan had already handed me. "You seem different lately," she said. "More yourself, almost." "I've been feeling more like myself," I told her. And that, at least, was the truest thing I'd said to her in 3 weeks. The night before the second birthday dinner, I couldn't sleep, so I sat at my own kitchen table, going through Diane's file one more time, the way you'd rehearse lines before a performance you couldn't afford to fumble. Ray showed up a little after midnight, uninvited, carrying a paper bag of diner food neither of us needed. "Figured you weren't sleeping," he said, dropping into the chair across from me, Eleanor's chair, and for once I let him sit there without flinching. "I'm not," I admitted. "Scared, mostly. Some part of me that's ashamed to still be scared, and underneath that, something that feels almost like relief that it's finally about to be over, whichever way it goes." "That doesn't sound like something to be ashamed of," Ray said, unwrapping a sandwich. "Sounds like exactly what a man's supposed to feel the night before he finally rewires the thing that's been shorting out his whole family." We sat there another hour, not talking about the case anymore. Just two old friends eating bad diner food in a quiet kitchen at midnight, the way we used to after long jobs decades ago, before either of us had buried a wife or discovered what our own children were capable of when desperate enough. It didn't fix anything, but it steadied my hands enough that by the time Ray finally left, a little after 1 in the morning, I felt ready, for the first time in 3 weeks, to stop performing and start finishing what my granddaughter's whisper had started at my own birthday table. The second birthday dinner started the same way the first one had. Candles, a cake from the good bakery, Derek pouring wine, except this time I knew exactly what every person at that table was capable of, and exactly what was sitting in Diane's briefcase in my den, waiting. Marcus Feld arrived a little after 6, exactly the kind of man his photographs had suggested he'd be. Expensive haircut, a watch that cost more than most of my old work trucks, a handshake calibrated to feel warm without meaning anything. Vanessa introduced him to Doris and my neighbors as her business consultant, a man helping the restaurant restructure its finances, and I shook his hand and told him I'd heard a lot about him, which was truer than anyone in that room understood. Derek was quiet that whole first hour, and I caught him twice studying Feld with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not suspicion exactly, not yet, but something in the neighborhood of it, the way a man looks at a stranger standing slightly too close to something he's supposed to be the only one holding. Deanne arrived at 7, exactly on schedule, along with the elder abuse investigator from the county, a calm, unhurried woman named Rosa Fenn, who introduced herself simply as a friend of mine there to help me with some paperwork, which raised exactly one eyebrow in the room. Vanessa's. Before conversation moved on, I let the meal go almost all the way through before I did anything. I let Vanessa cut the cake herself, this time, and watched her hand hesitate for one telling half-second over which slice to place in front of me before she seemed to catch herself and set down a piece indistinguishable from any other. I didn't eat it. I'd told everyone I was watching my sugar these days, doctor's orders, and nobody argued with an old man protecting his own heart. Before we get to dessert properly, I said, once the singing had died down and the room had settled into that comfortable post-cake lull, I wanted to say a few things, since this is technically my birthday do-over, and an old man's allowed a little sentimentality on his own night. I stood up. I felt Ray's hand find my shoulder briefly from where he sat beside me, a small steadying pressure, there and gone. 3 weeks ago, at my first birthday dinner this year, my granddaughter leaned over and whispered 5 words that saved my life, I said. And I watched the room's easy warmth curdle in real time, watched Vanessa's face do the thing Feld's face had done in his own client meetings twice before. The calculation of a woman realizing the floor beneath her had just been quietly rewired without her noticing. "Grandpa, don't eat that," she told me. And about 90 seconds later, somebody in this house cut the power to every circuit in it, in the dark, wearing hand cream I happened to recognize. "Walter, I think you're confused," Vanessa started, her voice pitched with exactly the gentle, concerned patience she'd been practicing on me for 3 weeks. "I'm not confused," I said. "That's rather the point, isn't it? That's what the sedative in my blood work that night was supposed to fix. That's what Dr. Renner's competency evaluation, the one I never actually sat for, by the way, in case anyone's curious how thorough it was supposed to establish for the hearing you all filed 11 days after my birthday. That's what you needed, Vanessa. A confused old man. Easy enough to manage that somebody else could step in and manage $2,100,000 on his behalf." Derek's fork had stopped halfway to his mouth. "Dad, what are you talking about? What hearing? Ask your wife." I said gentler than I felt, because whatever came next, I needed my son to hear it from someone other than me first if there was any way to spare him that. "Or ask Mr. Feld here, since I understand he's the one who filed the petition on Vanessa's behalf, recommending his own firm as conservator." The color drained out of Derek's face the way it does when a man's entire understanding of his own life reorganizes itself in real time. "What petition?" Feld, to his credit, tried the bedside voice first. The same practiced calm I imagine he'd used on 2 other families before mine. "Mr. Briggs, I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about the nature of—" "Save it," Diane said, standing. Opening the briefcase she'd kept beside her chair all evening, producing a folder thick enough to double as a doorstop. "I'm Walter's attorney. This is Rosa Fenn, an investigator with the county's Elder Protective Services Unit. We have documentation of an unauthorized sedative in Walter's system the night of his original birthday dinner, physical evidence of a deliberately disabled electrical panel, a fraudulent competency evaluation filed under Dr. Renner's name for an examination that never took place, and records of 2 prior conservatorship arrangements involving Mr. Feld's firm and elderly clients, whose estates were substantially depleted under his management. I'd strongly recommend nobody at this table say anything further without their own counsel present." Rosa Fenn stepped forward and produced her credentials, her voice flat and procedural in the way that somehow made the whole scene feel more final than any raised voice could have. "Mr. Feld, we've opened a formal investigation into the guardianship petition filed on Mr. Briggs's behalf, as well as a pattern complaint regarding 2 prior clients. I'll need to ask you some questions." "This is insane," Vanessa said, standing now too, her earlier softness gone entirely, replaced by something harder and more frightened. "Walter, we were trying to help you. You've been forgetting things. "I haven't forgotten a single thing," I said. "Not the sedative, not the breaker, not the man in the gray suit my 8-year-old granddaughter drew a picture of months ago, because she noticed him visiting the house while my son was at work and didn't know what she was looking at." The room went very still at that. Derek turned slowly toward his wife, and I watched something in his face I hope I never have to see again on someone I love. The specific collapse of a man realizing the ground he'd been standing on for years had never been solid at all. "What man in a gray suit?" Derek said, very quietly. Vanessa didn't answer. She looked instead at Feld, one quick, involuntary glance that lasted less than a second, and told my son everything Diane's entire folder hadn't quite managed to. You, Derek said, and his voice cracked on the single word in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. You and him, Derek, it's not what you think, Vanessa started. It's exactly what I think, Derek said. And then, to my genuine surprise, he turned toward Feld, not toward me, not toward the folder in Diane's hands, and said low and shaking, "Get out of my father's house." I want to tell you that moment felt like triumph, and some small ugly part of it did. But mostly, watching my son's marriage come apart at a table I'd set with my late wife's good dishes, it felt like watching a house catch fire that I'd known for weeks was wired wrong and hadn't been able to stop from burning, only from burning at a time, and in a way I could control. Feld tried one more time to salvage something professional out of the wreckage, some line about how this was all easily explained, how the family was clearly under stress and misreading a legitimate business relationship, but Rosa Fenn simply repeated her request that he accompany her to answer some questions, and something in his composure finally broke, the practiced calm sliding off him the way it had, apparently, twice before with two other families who'd trusted him. Dr. Renner, it turned out over the following weeks, folded almost immediately once the state medical board's investigator showed him the discrepancy between his signed evaluation and the fact that no such examination had ever taken place. A forged document is a different, much more dangerous animal for a physician than a merely questionable one, and he surrendered his license, rather than fight a fraud charge he had no real defense against. Feld's firm collapsed under the weight of the county's pattern investigation once the two prior families came forward, encouraged by Callahan's outreach, to add their own testimony to mine. He pleaded guilty to elder financial exploitation and conspiracy rather than risk trial, and the judge, unmoved by his attorney's argument about a previously unblemished professional record, gave him 3 years, with restitution ordered to all 3 families, though I understood from Diane that restitution and actual recovered money rarely resemble each other very closely. Vanessa's part in it was more complicated, legally and otherwise. She hadn't forged Renner's evaluation herself, hadn't personally engineered Feld's prior schemes, and her own attorney argued, not without some merit, that she'd been drawn into something larger than she'd fully understood the shape of. She pleaded guilty to a lesser charge tied to the sedative and the guardianship petition itself, avoided prison through a plea that hinged on her cooperation in the broader investigation into Feld, and was sentenced to probation, mandatory restitution toward my legal costs, and the loss of any claim whatsoever to my trust or estate, present or future. Derek filed for divorce 2 weeks after that dinner. I'm not going to pretend that was anything but painful for everyone involved, including, in whatever complicated way, people can still hold on to for someone who's hurt them badly, for Derek himself. There was a night, about a month after everything had come apart publicly, that I want to tell you about, because it's the part of this story that matters more to me now than the moment Vanessa's face went white at my own dinner table. Derek showed up at my house unannounced, late, the way Ray usually did. Except this was the first time in longer than either of us wanted to admit that my son had come to my door needing something, rather than performing that everything was fine. We sat at the kitchen table, Eleanor's table, her chair empty between us because neither of us claimed it, and for a long time, neither of us said much of anything. Finally, Derek said, "I keep thinking about how long I looked away from what was happening right in front of me. With Vanessa. With you. I know something about looking away from things I didn't want to see," I told him. And then I said the thing I'd been carrying since long before any of this started, since the emergency room, since the night I stood in my own garage staring at a breaker panel somebody I trusted had cut in the dark. I did the same thing to my own mother, Derek, years ago. She begged me not to put her in that home, told me she was scared and lonely and didn't want to leave her own house, and I told myself I knew better, because it was easier than sitting with how frightened she actually was. I've spent a lot of nights this past month understanding that some of what made it so easy for people to try to do the same thing to me is that I once decided it was acceptable to do it to somebody who trusted me. Derek was quiet a long moment, and then he did something neither of us had done easily in years. He reached across that table and gripped my hand, hard, the way you hold on to something you're afraid of losing. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said, "for all of it. For not listening to Lily sooner. For not looking closer at Vanessa. For not being there enough when I was a kid for you to ever learn how to ask me for help instead of just fixing everything alone. We've both got some rewiring to do," I told him, and for the first time since the whole nightmare started, we both actually laughed, quiet and a little broken, but real. I gave him something that night I'd been holding on to since going through some old box in the attic during those 3 tense weeks before the dinner, a thing that felt too important to hand over any earlier, before he'd earned the context to understand it properly. It was a letter Eleanor had written to Derek not long before she died, one she'd apparently never worked up the courage to give him, tucked into the family Bible, where I'd found it while looking, half desperately, for something of hers to hold on to during the worst nights of that month. I don't know everything it said. I only read enough to know it wasn't mine to keep from him any longer. A few lines about how she worried, near the end of her life, that Derek had learned to measure love by what people could give him rather than by what they were willing to sacrifice for him, and how she hoped that someday, if it ever mattered, he'd remember that the people who truly loved him would never ask him to choose between comfort and honesty. I handed it to him and left the kitchen for a few minutes to let him read it alone, and when I came back he was crying in a way I don't believe I'd ever actually watched my son cry, not even at his mother's funeral, and I sat back down across from him and let him. There was a second thing that happened in those weeks that I think about even more than the dinner itself, and it involves Lily, so I'll tell it as carefully as I can. About 3 weeks after the divorce filing, Derek brought her over for a Saturday, and while he was in the garage talking to Ray about something unrelated, Lily and I sat at the kitchen table, and she asked me, very seriously, whether she'd done something wrong by writing everything down in her notebook. "You did the bravest thing anybody in this whole story did," I told her. "You noticed something was wrong when every single grown-up around you was pretending everything was fine, and you found a way to tell somebody the truth even when you weren't sure anybody would believe you. That's not something you did wrong, sweetheart. That's something most adults never manage to do their whole lives." She thought about that for a while, swinging her feet against the kitchen chair. "Is Mommy going to be okay?" "I think your mom's got some hard years ahead of her," I said, "because I promised you honesty, and I wasn't going to start lying to an 8-year-old now, of all people. But I think she's going to be okay eventually. And I think the most important thing for you to know is that none of what happened is because of anything you did or said. You were the one person in this whole story who did everything right." The state's investigation into Feld's broader pattern of elder exploitation ended up helping both of his other 2 victims recover a portion of what they'd lost, which mattered to me nearly as much as my own outcome did by the time everything settled. There's a particular kind of satisfaction in learning that the worst thing that happened to you also became the reason 2 strangers finally got some justice they'd already given up, hoping for. Ray still runs Briggs Electric 2 blocks from where I used to run it myself, and some mornings I still stop by just to stand in that shop and smell cut wire and flux the way some men go to church. He still gives me grief for turning into, as he puts it, a courtroom strategist in my golden years, and I still tell him I only did the wiring. Diane did the legal work. I hosted a 3rd birthday dinner, if you can believe it, about 8 months after the second one, a proper one this time. No candles blown out prematurely, no strangers in expensive watches, just Derek and Lily and Ray and Doris and a handful of my old apprentices from the shop who'd shown up, without my asking a single one of them, to the guardianship hearing months earlier, simply because Ray had mentioned I might need some familiar faces in the courtroom, and who'd sat quietly in the back row that whole afternoon, not saying a word, just being there. Lily helped me cut the cake that 3rd birthday, insisting on doing the actual slicing herself with a level of 8-year-old concentration that made everyone at the table go quiet and watch. When she handed me my slice, she looked up at me with the same seriousness she'd had the night. She whispered 5 words that saved my life, and she said, "You can eat this one, Grandpa." I made sure. I sat there at my own kitchen table, in Eleanor's chair, surrounded by the people who'd actually earned the right to call themselves my family, and I ate every bite. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's something I've come to believe more firmly than almost anything else in 64 years of living. Patience isn't the same thing as weakness, and it isn't the same thing as forgiveness either. Sometimes patience is simply the discipline to cut the power on your own terms before you go anywhere near the exposed wire somebody else left for you in the dark, and to trust that when you finally do go looking, you'll find exactly what you need to fix it for good. If you liked this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more real, raw, and family-centered stories, because the next one might just save somebody in your own life the way 5 whispered words once saved mine.